aware of our negative thinking instead of just going around and giving up some luxuries and things like that. We don't just want to give up things, we want to do something positive. Every time we give something up, we want to put something positive in its place. So we're going to take an additional step of putting something, a practice in the place of what it is we're going to release. And we've been getting those practices from a little book called The 4 Agreements. It's the source of our positive practices. Here are the 4 agreements up here. Let's see if we got that. There it is. So far we've covered the first 3. Be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally. Don't make assumptions. And today, always do your best. I have to confess that the first time I read this book and I got to the 4th agreement, I was, shall we say, slightly underwhelmed. I found it to be a little bit anticlimactic, right? I read, well, always do your best. Well, you know, duh. But it's deceptively simple, because when we start to unpack it, we find how something that's seemingly so simple can really help us to improve a lot of different aspects of our lives. You know, when I first read Always Do Your Best, the first thing I was reminded of was the Boy Scout oath. And I think maybe the Girl Scouts had something similar, right? You might remember. You know, you'd raise your hand at every meeting. You would say, "On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to yada, yada, yada," right? We had to recite that at every troop meeting. And never once did anyone invite us to reflect on what it actually meant. I suppose that would have been an exercise in futility for a bunch of 10-year-olds, but still, it was not something we really reflected on with any kind of depth. So let's do that. Let's talk about what it means to do your best. Who gets to decide what best is? What standard is used? Do I have to be perfect? Or is excellent sufficient? How about just good enough? Or adequate? You know, if I think I could have done better, then I didn't really do my best, did I? But don't we often think that we can do better next time, right? So if that's true, then I can never do my best, so why bother? See what I just did there? I talked myself out of it. I call that the Homer Simpson approach. Homer Simpson, the man who said, if something is too hard to do, then it's not worth doing. Or the other thing that he said was this. He said, you tried your best and you failed miserably. The lesson is never try. Of course, we all know what Master Yoda would have to say about that. Yoda would say, do or do not. There is no try. All right, so that's quite a mess, isn't it? Doing your best isn't about perfection. It's not about living up to other people's standards and expectations. It's not about striving. It's not about trying. Here's what it means according to the 4 agreements. Doing your best is taking action because you love it, not because you're expecting a reward. Most people do exactly the opposite. They only take action when they expect a reward and they don't enjoy the action. And that's the reason why they don't do their best. Okay, so that's easy enough to understand, but is it realistic? Can we really love everything we do? I can say that I love what I do here as a minister, but not everything. I remember a few years ago, we had a sewer backup here at the church, right next door in the 2 bathrooms down here. And once the plumber cleared the clog, there was a big mess left over. And there happened to be an event that night, all right? There wasn't really enough time to get on the phone and try to put together a volunteer team. You know how that works. You can spend time on the phone trying to get people together, and if it doesn't happen, then there's not enough time to do the job anyway, right? Or to call in a service from outside. So guess who had to do it? And I can honestly say that I did not love it. But Karen and I did it. I had a little experience spending summers on dairy farms when I was a kid, mucking out calf pens and stuff like that, right? So it's not something you enjoy, but it's something that you have to do. And so we did it, and when we were done, you couldn't tell that anything had happened, but I'll tell you, we didn't like it one bit. And it was ours to do, so what do? You hold your nose and you wade in, and that's what happens. You know, sometimes the effort has to be for the sake of the effort, for the sake of doing something right, just because it needs to be done. You've probably heard the saying, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? That was said by Congressman John Lewis back when he was one of the original freedom riders during the Civil Rights Movement. You might recall those folks. The Supreme Court had ruled that segregated public buses were unconstitutional, but many southern states simply ignored the ruling, and they kept on segregating their buses. So the freedom riders went to all of those segregated states where they were regarded as outside agitators, and they rode on the buses with white people and sat at the whites-only lunch counters. I don't think they loved getting beaten and arrested. Freedom riders threatened, attacked, jailed. They burned one of the buses they were on, along with other atrocities. I don't think they enjoyed any of that, but we can say that they did what they did because they loved freedom. And they were willing to pay the price it would take to raise consciousness. That was the ultimate goal. I read something once that said that Martin Luther King and the other leaders of the civil rights movement were marching with the Constitution in one hand and the Bible in the other hand. So now we're on the weeks leading up to Easter, and we often take time to reflect on the example that was left to us by Jesus as he did something similar, right? He walked into this lion's den called Jerusalem all those years ago, and he knew full well what he was getting himself into. He was willing to pay the price in order to raise consciousness. That's what he was up to. You know, there were many who believed that maybe he was going to raise an army, drive the Romans out, or that he was going to somehow rally the people to overthrow their own corrupt leaders. But as history tells us, the only weapons that Jesus had were truth and determination. And he knew what the end game was going to be, but he never slowed down. He never watered down his message. He knew that the Romans would routinely kill people who stirred things up, defied their authority. Capital punishment was the rule and not the exception. And if they wanted to make an example out of you, they would use crucifixion as the method of execution. So we wonder, what was it that kept him moving forward with that kind of determination and focus? What was it that allowed those freedom riders to get on those buses knowing that there were going to be people hurling rocks and fire bombs at them? Do you have to be the Son of God with magical supernatural powers in order to do what Jesus did and to put his values into action? There was a book by Unity minister Ernest Wilson called The Week That Changed the World, and he tells the story of what happened between Palm Sunday and Easter. And he says that Jesus was possessed by a divine purpose and vision that not even those closest to him shared. He said, when a man has a big enough sense of purpose, he loses himself and yet finds a greater self in his absorption or dedication to the purpose. It doesn't require you to be superhuman, Son of God, or anything else. It requires losing yourself and finding a greater self. There's that important distinction between being egocentric and being other-centric or world-centric, or another word for it is altruistic. That important distinction between being an egotist and being altruistic. You know, we sometimes hear the term small self and higher self. Well, in unity jargon, you hear the word Christ, which is what we call the higher self because it was the state of consciousness that was demonstrated by the man called Jesus. The small self is the part of us that likes to say that certain activities are too boring, too dirty, or too beneath our dignity, or perhaps even too dangerous. That kind of gets us to hold back. Homer Simpson, the anti-hero, he's the voice of the small self. We need an anti-hero character every now and then to remind us of how easy it is to give in and fall short of the 4 agreements, or any of our agreements. You know, he reminds us, Homer does, that we've all done and said the same things at one time or another, listening to the voice of the small self or the egocentric self. There he is, trying to decide who he's going to listen to, the small self or the higher self. That's a choice that we make every single day. So it's that higher self, or as we say in unity, the Christ nature that wants us to have a big sense of purpose. Now that doesn't mean grandiose, simply means clear, compelling. We're clear on it. We're motivated by it. It's something that helps us to be able to get out of bed in the morning. That's enough. It has to value the well-being of others as much as it values our own well-being. It's like that old Buddhist precept that says, realize that self and other are one. When you truly get that, then we value the well-being of others as much as we value our own. Okay, so it's not so much a matter of loving every single individual activity in the sense that we have fun or enjoy doing it. It's a matter of loving our larger purpose in life and then using that to drive every single activity of life, no matter how small it may seem to the small self. It's a way that we can use to engage in a life that is so important that it deserves the full measure of our attention and our best effort, no matter what it is we're doing. If we have a larger purpose that's worthy, then everything that we do in furtherance of that purpose is worthy of our best effort. You know, sometimes we hear people who speak derisively of minimum wage jobs, right? One of the worst things you could apparently be is a burger flipper at McDonald's, right? I mean, you hear that old trope. It's considered to be demeaning. Well, why? Why? If you're in love with your life, if you have a purpose that you're pursuing and trying to support, you're going to gladly do whatever it takes. And if that means flipping burgers, then we're going to make sure that we are the best burger flipper that we know how to be. So that when we move on to whatever comes next, they'll look back and say, hey, wow, that guy was some kind of a great burger flipper. That's sufficient. And of course we have to be careful that the ego doesn't hijack our desire to do our best and use it as a way to demonstrate our superiority. We can get into that trap too, right? The company expects me to flip 50 burgers an hour. I'll do 100 and I'll really show them how it's done, right? I'll show them. That's the ego talking. And when that happens, we're not doing our best, we're showing off. There's a difference. There's a difference. We're showing off. We're coming from a place of insecurity rather than integrity and love for life. So that's a pitfall to be aware of. We have to be cautious about our striving because the ego can take anything and use it for its own purposes. A few years ago, I picked up a great little book called The Dude and the Zen Master. There they are. It's a conversation between Jeff Bridges and Bernie Glassman, who is truly a Zen master. Actually, I should say was. He died last year. The Dude and the Zen Master. And early on in the book, I read something that really caught my attention. Jeff Bridges is spending a page or so talking about his spiritual background, all right? Listen to this. He said, from the beginning, my mother used to pass around the daily word. which was my basic spiritual training when I was growing up. It comes from Unity, which is Christian-based and also very open. I think it has a lot of Zen Buddhist leanings. She would pass it around and make all the kids read it. Interesting. Yeah. So later on, the dude and the Zen master are talking about the problems that can arise when the ego gets a hold of our expectations. We want other people to admire us, so we strive so hard to be perfect that we're afraid to act and we can't function. That's the other thing we have to be careful of. That's what can happen when we lose sight of the big picture aspect of our life and things become a drag. So at this point, Jeff Bridges is talking about some advice that he got from his mother. More advice from his mother. She must have been a wise woman. Here's what he said. He said, years later, when she sent me off to work, she'd always say, remember, have fun. Don't take it too seriously. He says, so I have this word for much of what I do in life. Plorking. Plorking. I'm not playing. I'm not working. I'm plorking. Plorked his way to an Academy Award there, he did. Not too shabby. And of course, the Oscar was not the goal. You see, that's the interesting thing. The Oscar was not the goal. It was a bonus that came from doing his best, not taking himself too seriously, and being able to pour himself into a role, because what mattered was being able to make that character and the dialogue come alive. The Oscar was the icing on the cake. So today, Jeff Bridges is going to get the last word about how we might want to go about doing our best. And he said, live like you're already dead, man. Have a good time. Do your best. Let it all come ripping right through you. Not from you or by you, but through you, which is how we bypass the ego and learn what it means to do our best. So, happy plorking, everyone. See you next week.